Before we get started, I just want to point out that Demeter, the name of the ship, is also the name of the Greek goddess of agriculture and harvesting. Seems kind of fitting when you consider that Dracula is essentially using the crew as livestock to be harvested on. That's just a neat little bit of subtle symbolism from the original book that I couldn't fit into the review. Don't say I never taught you nothing. Alright, before we get started, as always, a quick thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. If you enjoy the content I make and would like to offer your support for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name listed right here at the start of every video. Link to that is in the description below. And now, let's get into the actual review.
He is on this ship, which means that we will never leave it.
The devil is real. May God have mercy on us all.
The last voyage of the Demeter takes a chapter from Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, literally, in adapting the voyage of Dracula from Romania to England on a ship called the Demeter, and how that fateful trip actually played out from the perspective of the crew. This movie has been stuck in development hell for 2 decades. The first draft of the screenplay was finished in 2002. Since then, it has been bouncing around several different directors and lead stars, like Jude Law, Viggo Mortensen, and Ben Kingsley were all cast at some point. And the screenplay had apparently been rewritten and rewritten over and over again, until finally Amblin picked up the rights and actually started making the film in 2019. And to some extent, I can understand why Hollywood wanted to make this film. Especially when you hear the original screenwriter, Braggy Shute Jr., pitch this film as a Dracula story told like Alien. That combination on paper seems like a really good idea, especially since they are taking a real chapter from the original Bram Stoker novel, one that's sometimes flat out ignored in other adaptations, and fleshing it out to feature length. And yeah, this is actually a good idea. This is actually a chapter from the original novel that could be fleshed out to tell its own story. And to the film's credit, it does do a lot of things really right, and sometimes it's even truly great. Unfortunately, the film is also plagued with significant issues, some of them being as small as just artistic decisions that I disagree with. However, some are more obvious flaws like plot holes. But before I actually get into the nitty-gritty of what's wrong, I do want to praise this film for a little bit, because believe it or not, there is a lot to admire about this film. For starters, this film has incredible production design. A lot of the period elements to try to teleport you back to this time era are done really well. You never have an issue believing that we really are back in the 1800s. The set design for the towns, cities, and the ship really is incredible. The film also has a wonderful gothic atmosphere about the whole thing, and it exudes it really well. The imagery in this film is really quite stark, and it can help punctuate already frightening moments to make them stand out, which I think is a credit to Andre Overdahl's direction. The film does a good job at establishing the characters. For the most part, the group of characters that we follow actually seem like decent people and like real people, and you don't want anything bad to happen to them. So in that regard, this film does feel like an old school monster movie, creating a set of well-established characters and then unleashing a nightmare for them to have to fight against. And give the actors credit, they're well cast and they perform their parts well. Corey Hawkins, Aisling Françoisi, Liam Cunningham, David Dastmalchian, and Woody Norman are all great here. Another element that I really appreciated was that the film typically doesn't over-rely on CGI. They do make use of practical effects whenever they can, especially when it comes to the gore and the graphic depictions of violence, and they're extremely well done. Many of the scenes involving death in general are just well done. They're built up properly and are handled effectively. And I don't normally bring this up, but the soundtrack for this film has some real bangers, especially the song that played during the credits. That is an incredible, atmospheric piece of gothic music from Bear McCreary that I could see myself listening to on its own, which I almost never do. So yeah, you're probably thinking, wow, this sounds like a great movie. And yeah, I was gonna be on that same boat until we get to the film's third act, and this is where the film really starts to lose me. Now, I'm gonna try to be as vague as possible to avoid spoilers, but at one point, some of the characters are searching for something, and they end up finding it, but they don't actually do anything with it. In fact, this actually ends up creating a massive plot hole, especially since they don't even attempt to utilize it in their fight against Dracula, even though they would have the upper hand, especially with the information that they should have by that point. Unless there's something that I'm just missing, I have no idea why the scene was included. The film also does make use of some tired horror tropes that I don't like. Fake jump scares and characters taking, honestly, longer than they should figuring out that something is wrong. And while I did note that the film used practical effects and makeup whenever they could, they did sometimes have to make use of CG, particularly CGI fire, and it looks pretty terrible. And then there's also the film's climax, one that I feel just isn't that satisfying. It just kind of goes with your stereotypical Hollywood-style climax that doesn't really feel like it was what the film was building to. It's weird, it's like it somehow made Dracula in the climax both too difficult to fight, and yet too easy to fight at the same time, which I didn't even know was possible. And then there's the film's ending. And when I say ending, I mean literal last minute of the movie. It sucks. I felt like there could have been a really creepy and ominous and, dare I say, ambiguous note this film could have ended on, and it would have been fine. But instead, the film keeps going, and they end the film on an almost triumphant note, like they're trying to set up a sequel, even though that doesn't make any sense when you consider what the Demeter's role was in the original story. And finally, speaking of the original story, we do need to spend some time talking about what I think is the biggest problem / missed opportunity of this movie, and that is this film's portrayal of Dracula himself. Dracula is a character that I've never really seen done correctly, at least not in a straightforward adaptation. There is a tendency among filmmakers to try to make him look like either the Bela Lugosi version or an ugly, grotesque monster very similar to Count Orlok and Nosferatu. And neither of these are the portrayals from the book, where he's portrayed as somebody who could pass for an aristocrat. He also typically uses methods of seduction to lure his victims in. Dracula is supposed to be a representation of the worst aspects of high-class society, a walking undead corpse who lives off of the fresh young blood of those who are lower status than him. There's supposed to be an air of debonair about him, someone who puts on just enough of a front to hide the monster he actually is underneath. Someone who is pure evil but is still cunning. This film essentially portrays him as someone who's an almost animalistic, wordless demon. He just kind of feels like your stereotypical mindless movie monster, a creature who kills without rhyme or reason, albeit with just a little bit more intelligence. In the book, the men on the Demeter went missing without a trace, almost like they were swallowed alive by the shadows. Not so here. They're dispatched like victims in a slasher film, and they are given messy, painful, horrifying deaths. By far the biggest deviation from the book is that it actually goes the route that sunlight kills vampires by making them burst into flames, which is not at all the case in Stoker's novel. As a matter of fact, in the chapter this film is based on, the captain talks about how there's a mysterious man wandering around the deck in the daytime, so he's actually amidst the crew even in the day. But there's also the fact that in this film, crucifixes don't seem to repel him at all, which completely misses the point of what vampires are supposed to be, but whatever. In fact, the only thing that actually got carried over explicitly from the book was that Dracula has to return to his own native soil every night, or every day, almost like he's returning to his grave. And the reason why I'm even mentioning these differences at all is because this film goes out of its way in the opening scene to say that this is the untold story of what happened on the Demeter in the original book, and it's really not. This is more of a reinterpretation of that scene, especially with the way the movie ends. I just think that if you're going to make that connection, I would think that you would just stick a little bit closer to Bram Stoker's original vision. To an extent, I almost feel bad for this film. You can see the vision that the original screenwriter and the director had for it, and it's almost there. Like they're about to break through to the surface for a breath, but they stopped just before they made it. And I hesitate to say the problem is that it needed one more rewrite, since I actually think the extensive rewrites are where some of the problems started creeping in. And even with the finished product that we got, there is still a ton to admire about it. But man alive, does this film have some holes in it. Now, as a horror film with a generic monster as the villain, this mostly works, but at the same time, it doesn't quite stick the landing with the ending. And those looking for a story that actually feels like it could fit in right with the original novel are going to be extremely disappointed. But at the same time, I definitely can't ignore all the good or even great things this film does. It looks fantastic, has a real visual flair, the performances are great. For a horror film, it actually has well-defined characters that you mostly care about. The film lets these events and the deaths sink in, and I do greatly respect any horror film that makes use of practical effects whenever it can. I can see opinions about this film being absolutely all over the place, and possibly be seen as a cult classic years down the road. So my verdict, if this looks interesting to you, even a little bit, then I say give it a chance. Even though I had issues with it, even though it ultimately goes in a direction that I didn't really like that much, I can't even say for a second that I regretted seeing it, and the ride this film took me on in the first 2 acts was worth it. The last voyage of the Demeter gets a half-full shot. And I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you want to see my early thoughts of any film I watch or to read more of my reviews, make sure to check out my Letterboxd account. The link to that is in the description below. And make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss any upcoming reviews. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.